So we've covered most of the laws of Tzitizis. We have just a little bit more. So let's just run through what we've covered. And please God, today we will conclude the section 9, which deals with Tzitizis. Okay. Spoke about the specialty of this mitzvah, how it reminds us of all the mitzvahs, about the two types. There's the small talus, the talus katan, referred to as tzitzis, which is worn all day. There's the talus gadol, which is worn for davening. We spoke about how it needs to be bought from a trusted source because the tzitzis needs to be done by hand for the purpose of the mitzvah in the correct way by a Jew. A number of qualifications over there. We spoke about not mixing wool and linen, meaning that onto a wool garment you wouldn't put linen strings. We spoke about the hole, where the hole exactly is situated, not too far, not too close. We spoke about all the nuts and coils, the 5 double nuts and all the coils in between. We spoke about how the tzitzis need to be tied directly and not indirectly, meaning there shouldn't be something else that's done which makes it kosher. And we'll touch more upon that today. Okay, the length of the strings, about 23 centimeters, a third of them tied. Ideally, the sides should be kept separate. And then we spoke about wearing tzitzis. So before you put them on, you do your daily inspection. It's important to mention that on Shabbos, you actually need to be careful not to tighten any loose knots, because one is not allowed to tie a knot on Shabbos. It's one of the 39 forbidden labors of Shabbos. So on Shabbos, you'll be inspecting them. But what you should actually do is put your fingers over the knot area and just kind of inspect from below that. And that way you remind yourself that if there's any knots that are coming untied, which I actually noticed on Yom Tov, one of my knots had come loose, but I wasn't able to do anything about it. So tighten your knots and you check that nothing's ripped. You make a bracha. And we spoke about how first you wrap it like the Arabs do, because that's a complete wrap. But that only is for a few seconds, and then you wear it regularly. It's a daytime mitzvah. If you take it off, you could put it back on without making another bracha, provided when you took it off, you intended to put it back on within the near future. We spoke about how you are allowed to borrow a person's talus without their permission. Obviously, this is if they're not around to ask them, and provided that you use it where you find it, and that you fold it up when you're done, unless it's Shabbos and you don't fold your talus on Shabbos. And that takes us to where we are up to today. A few more additional points. So as far as material is concerned, just to first discuss this outside, there are some authorities that are of the opinion that if you look at the way the Torah refers to the mitzvah of tzitzis, the understanding is that the strings should be of the same material as the garments. And that's the premise for this halacha. He says, if your actual garment is made of multiple materials, then you're going to have an issue because you're not going to be able to have the strings match the material because it's a mix. Things are mixed up. And therefore, he's going to advise to stick to one particular material and then make sure that the strings match that very same material. Let's run through the text. When the Torah refers to wool, or the paiskim, which mean the later halakhic authorities, they usually mean sheep's or ram's wool, meaning wool by default means lamb's wool, not camel wool, not other types of wool, but lamb's wool. A pious person should not recite the bracha over a talus in which the warp threads are made of wool and the woof threads are made of cotton, silk or the like, or the reverse. That is, the woof threads are made of wool and the warp threads are of another material. Now, he said a pious person. Why does he say a pious person? Because as I mentioned, it's a matter of halakhic debate whether indeed the strings need to be the same material as the garments. So therefore, you could get away with it, but really if you're trying to do the mitzvah the best way, be sure that the garment is made of 100% pure, the material that you are using. I shouldn't say 100% pure, but it should be made of that material. Okay, because some places can maintain that even tzitzis made of wool only help a garment that's made of the same material. Similarly, over a talus made of silk and the tzitzis are made of wool, a bracha would not be recited. Because as we said, when in doubt, go without. That's a principle with all brachas, with exception for benching. That whenever you're not sure whether or not to make a bracha, rather go without, because you don't want to mention Hashem's name in vain. But rather, you should first recite the bracha over a woolen talus that has woolen strings, and then wrap yourself, remove it, and then put whatever other talus on that you'd like. Okay. However, if the tzitzis of the silk talus were also made of silk, then you can't make a bracha, because there we have the strings are of the very same material as the garments. And he says tzitzis of silk are not common in our countries because tzitzis must be spun for the purpose of tzitzis. So it's going to be quite tricky to spin those strings for the purpose of tzitzis, but make them out of silk instead of wool. So that's why, generally speaking, your talus gadol, at least, which is the large talus that you use for davening, is, I think all the ones that I've seen are generally made of wool with woolen strings. And then as far as the undergarment, the small talus, the one that usually goes under the shirt, many will suffice with other materials because they're more comfortable. But he says the pious strive to use specifically a wool garment with wool strings. Okay, if the tzitzis are partially made of silk and partially made of wool, it is even worse. Makes things more complicated. So that's about having the strings of the same material as the garment. Now, what's a little bit more relevant to us, because chances are we're just going to a store and buying tzitzis, although we want to make sure that it comes from a good source, is what happens if the strings get ripped. So this we actually discussed already previously. I'll just mention briefly, if one string rips just on the bottom, it's not a problem. If two, it may be a problem. And if three, it definitely is a problem. If the strings, however, rip all the way up on top, where they go through the garment, then that is definitely a problem. So we'll move on to halacha 14. Unraveled strings, that's also pretty common. I don't know if any of you ever noticed on your talus or talus that you came across that the strings began to be unraveled? It's pretty common.
Yeah.
So he says once the strings are unraveled, then they no longer considered, they're not in the form that they should be, and therefore they are as if they were cut off. So that's a problem. That disqualifies them. Okay. As far as 15 is concerned, okay. So this is a long introduction, which I'll just tell you outside. But so this is talking about a garment that could be divided into two. Let's say it had a zipper down the middle, or some kind of way that the garment could be taken apart and washed in two sections. Okay. So you want to take the garment apart, but what's going to happen if you take it apart? Once you take it apart, let's say it has a straight line that goes straight down the middle. How many corners does each part have?
4.
Correct. And how many strings do they each have?
2.
Okay. So right now you have a 4-cornered garment with only 2 strings. The moment you zipper it back up or you connect it again, however you're connecting it, then how many corners do you have?
4.
And how many strings?
4.
Now, what's the problem? Based on something we mentioned earlier. What went wrong over here? Anyone?
The zip got stuck.
No, the zip didn't get stuck. Not this time. The problem is that we said that the tzitzis need to be tied on, and through that, make the tzitzis kosher. It can't come about in an indirect fashion. But what you've done over here is you've taken a 4-cornered garment that only had 2 strings, and you kind of just ended up basically clipping the other 2 strings on without tying them on. And the Torah says that the tzitzis should be tied onto the garments. You with me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So therefore, just like we said earlier, that if the garment dripped and the strings came off, you can't just sew the strings back on because they need to be tied on. So similarly over here, when you zipper it back together, you've just kind of implanted the other 2 strings onto the garment without tying them on. So therefore, he says that before reconnecting the garment, you need to actually untie 2 of the strings. And then once you reconnect it, to tie those strings back. But then he says that's if it's a large enough garment that even when you split it in half, each section is considered a garment in its own right. But let's say you just had disconnected the corners. You kind of took off, you want to wash the talus, but you're worried the strings are going to get tangled. So you design a system where you could kind of just zipper off the corners. So then, even if you zipped off the two ends, and then when you put it back together, you tied the other two on, the first two strings already become disqualified because those strings were tied to a garment that's not considered a garment. So this kind of isn't quite relevant to us, but the point of it here is that however you try to utilize your creativity to make creative different types of garments, the point is that the strings always need to be tied and not sewed and not clipped onto the garment. And the moment the strings are left hanging on a garment that doesn't have the minimal measure, then the strings would have to be untied and retied onto the garment once it does have the measurements that it requires. So that was number 15. Okay, continuing on the same notes, torn talus. So if the corner of the talus was either cut or torn and became completely separated from the talus, so the area of that piece is less than 3 handbreadths by 3 handbreadths, there are those that will maintain that this piece, even after it's resewn properly to the talus, is invalid for attaching tzitizis to it. So the scenario over here is he's saying, of course, you're going to need to retie the strings. But there's a larger issue. The issue isn't just retying the strings. Even if you do retie the strings, since that corner piece got completely cut off, it's not considered, even when you sew it back on, it's not considered as a garment in its own right. And therefore, that tzitizis can never be valid again. Since there is not in this piece 3 handbreadths by hand, three thumb breadths, sorry, that's 3 of these. So even if it is attached to the talus, it's still considered as separated. We should adhere to the strict view. However, if it isn't completely cut off, meaning if your tzitizis began to rip in the corner, but they still remain somewhat attached, then you would be able to resew it. Okay. He says the custom is, and now you'll notice that the next time you look at your talus, to sew a piece of cloth on the corners of the talus, because in many garments, even if they are new, there are pieces of cloth attached that are less than 3 agudin by 3 agudin, which are 3 thumb breadths. We therefore sew at the place that we attach the tzitizis, a piece of cloth. Basically, where the tzitizis are tied on should be a solid piece of material. And therefore, the custom is, you'll see that there's an added piece of material that's sewn onto the 4 corners of your garment for this particular purpose. Okay, this is a little bit more technical, but still part of the law, part of Torah study. Okay. Then he mentions another opinion, which is that there shouldn't actually be any sewing around the corner. So it actually should be sew free. I mean, it's quite amazing. Who would have ever imagined when you go and buy a talus, the amount of thought process that is being put into how it's designed? So some authorities hold that on the entire area of the corner, which is eligible for attaching the tzitizis, meaning from after the length of the first thumb knuckle, from after that, all the way till 3 of these, there should not be any stitches whatsoever with a thread that may be used in the making of tzitizis for this particular talus. For example, if the talus was made of linen, one should not sew there with linen threads, but use silk threads. Likewise, if the talus is made of silk, but use silk threads, not use that material. It is preferable to adhere to this strict view, also in regard to the hem that is made around the hole to reinforce it. All of the above, however, applies only to white thread, but with colored thread, there's no reason. So the issue over here is that we don't want, the Torah says strings. Now, what does it mean by strings? So he's saying if you're going to have thread on the corner of your talus that's made of the same material as the string, then you could start mixing up the string that's being used to sew and the string that's hanging. And therefore he says any sewing that's taking place in the vicinity of this corner should be made of a different material or a different color. Here you see, I don't know if you can see on the camera, the piece that is sewed on the garments. Okay, moving on to 18. So that was stitches. Okay, this is quite a common question. What happens to the strings when they do become ripped? What do you do with them? So if you wish to remove it, but before that, the question is, would you be allowed to untie your strings to put on newer strings Or would that be like kind of disrespectful to the first set of strings? He says, if you wish to remove the tzitzis from the talus in order to reattach the replacement tzitzis, which are more beautiful, or because one of the threads tore and you wish to attach completely new ones. I don't know if you've ever seen my father. After the time, he'll find a shul talus that one of the strings ripped, and he has a stash of strings in his stender, and he'll take it, he'll untie the old set, and he'll tie on a new set. And that's why sometimes you'll see on the talus at the one corner, the strings look different to the other because they've been replaced. He says that's fine, you can replace them. Even though the first ones were still valid, you can still go for an upgrade. It is nevertheless permissible to remove them since you're not nullifying the talus for the mitzvah of tzitzis, meaning you're not getting rid of a mitzvah, you're just going for an upgrade. On the contrary, you will be attaching more beautiful tzitzis. However, you should be careful not to throw the original tzitzis into a disrespectful place. So what this basically means is that you shouldn't throw them straight into the garbage, but if you were to first put them into an envelope or basically dispose for them in a respectful manner, then that's fine, meaning that they don't have to be buried. They're not considered a holy article. When it comes to the tefillin, for example, the tefillin straps are holy and they have to be buried. But when it comes to the strings, they're not considered holy. Nonetheless, since they were utilized for a mitzvah, we should show respect and not just chuck them in the garbage, but rather dispose of them respectfully. And here he gives actually another nice suggestion. Even tzitzis that have become invalid and were removed from the talus should not be thrown into the trash because it shows disrespect for the mitzvah. Some people are careful to place them in a holy book and to use them as a bookmark. So especially if it's a Torah book. So if you have a chumash at home and you have a piece of string that ripped, then you could use your tzitzis string as a bookmark, and that way it goes from one mitzvah to the next. It was being used to help you remind you of all the mitzvahs as tzitzis, and now it's being used to help remind you of what page you are on in your Torah studies. Okay, but since they were used to perform a mitzvah at one time, let them be used for another mitzvah. Likewise, a talus that has aged and is no longer worn as a mitzvah should not be used in a disrespectful way, meaning once the talus is no good, don't start using it as curtains, but rather it should be treated. The truth is, if it was as a curtain, it wouldn't necessarily be disrespectful. On the contrary, it would glorify your home. Again, it's not holy. It just needs to be treated with respect. So you wouldn't be able to use it as a cloth to clean the floor, but you would be allowed to use it in some other respectful way. You have people that make chuppahs out of a talus. Okay. When a person passes away, in Israel, they wrap the person in the talus. I believe all over, but in Israel it's just with the talus, but that's has its value. Okay, now this final point is quite interesting. If you go to Shul on Shabbos and discover that one of your strings have become invalid. Now, you can't borrow another talus because there is no other to borrow. And you're embarrassed to sit without a talus. Imagine you come to Shul, you have your beautiful talus. Let's say it's under COVID era and they've introduced the new regulations that allow people to come to Shul. You've signed up and you've been approved and you've been notified that you have been elected to be part of the social distance minyan when that happens. But you must bring your own talus to Shul and you bring it and you want to put it on. And you see, or you're wearing it, and you see that one of the corners, the strings have come off, which means that the talus is not kosher. So he says to avoid embarrassment, you would be allowed to keep it on, provided there was no other talus. Okay. Now, the reason for this is because the Torah doesn't say you are forbidden to wear a four-cornered garment without tzitzis. Rather, the Torah says you are required to put tzitzis on a four-cornered garment. And so because it falls under the category of a positive command, and it doesn't fall under the category of a violation of a negative command, therefore human dignity takes precedence. You wouldn't be able to make a bracha, and this is only if you couldn't have avoided it, if you didn't know of it in advance. And also, you wouldn't be able to wear that outside of the Erev because you would be considered carrying. Finally, 21. If a garment that requires tzitzis is worn without tzitzis, this constitutes transgressing a positive command. As I just said, the Torah doesn't say you are forbidden to wear a four-cornered garment without tzitzis, but it does say that you are required with tzitzis on your four-cornered garments. Therefore, if you don't, you've violated. You must be careful about certain garments that are made with 4 corners. If you've got some kind of tuxedo suit, so it kind of splits all the way up the back. So you have 4 corners. You have the 2 front corners, the front of your suit, and in the back, you have another 2 corners. So the average suit, the slit just goes up a little bit. It's not considered a corner. But if the slit goes all the way up, or majority of the way up, then you actually have a 4-cornered garment on your suit. And that would be a problem. You'd either have to punch holes and tie strings onto it, or you would have to round off one of the corners. He says it's not good enough to sew it round, but you'd actually have to cut it round. Thank you for joining us and wishing you a wonderful week.
Thanks, Rabbi. Cheers,
Thanks,
everybody.
Rabbi.